The executive dining room hummed with the rhythm of money, silverware clinking against porcelain, hushed negotiations over espresso, the steadying murmur of power. It was a machine that never stopped moving. Then, Victoria Kane's voice cut through the air like shattered glass. Right in the middle of the luxury cafeteria, she stopped. She leaned forward, jabbed a manicured finger, and the entire room went dead quiet. You. The word hit like a physical blow. Sofia stood on the other side of that finger. Her hands, covered in cheap plastic gloves, calmly balanced a tray of food. She wore a heavy gray apron over a simple collared shirt, her silver hair pulled neatly back, her dark eyes giving absolutely nothing away. She looked exactly like someone the executives were paid to look past, someone invisible. That was the entire point. Victoria stepped closer, her face contorted with rage, closing the distance until she was screaming mere inches from the older woman's face. Nobody moved. Nobody lifted a phone or spoke a word of defense because everyone at the tables already knew the rule, the unspoken, bone-deep rule of survival that kept their paychecks clearing. Never put yourself between Victoria Kane and her prey. Victoria struck the edge of the tray. It hit the polished marble floor with a sickening crash, ceramics shattering and food scattering across the stone. "Effective immediately," Victoria snarled, her voice carrying to the very back walls. "You're done here. Get out." Sofia looked down at the ruined meal at her feet. She didn't scramble to clean it up. She didn't offer a frantic apology. She lifted her head slowly, and when her eyes finally locked onto Victoria's, there was no panic in them. No humiliation, no trembling lip, just a steady, unyielding calm, and one question, quiet as a held breath. "Are you sure?" Victoria let out a sharp, mocking laugh, the kind that meant this conversation was already beneath her, and turned her back. She had absolutely no idea she had just made the last mistake of her career.
The silence that followed the crash wasn't just quiet, it was suffocating. In a room built for power lunches and million-dollar handshakes, the air suddenly felt too thick to breathe. 50 of the sharpest minds in the corporate sector sat frozen at their tables, their forks hovering over half-eaten solids, their eyes firmly locked onto anything that wasn't the shattered ceramic on the floor. A smear of dressing slowly seeped across the pristine marble, inching toward the polished toe of a junior analyst's Oxford shoe. The analyst didn't pull his foot back. He didn't even twitch. To move was to draw attention, and to draw Victoria Kane's attention in the middle of a purge was corporate suicide. That was the unwritten addendum in every employment contract at the Navarro Group. It wasn't in the handbook, but it was understood from day one. You survived by looking the other way. Victoria had built her empire within the company on a foundation of casual cruelty. She didn't just fire people, she unmade them. She made the necessary phone calls, flagged references, and ensured that whoever crossed her never worked in the city's financial district again. So they watched. They watched the older woman in the gray apron stand amidst the wreckage of a simple lunch. A few of the younger staff, the ones who still remembered what empathy felt like before the corporate grind beat it out of them, swallowed hard, their knuckles turning white around their coffee cups. A line cook peered nervously through the circular window of the kitchen's swinging doors, his face pale, but he didn't dare push the door open. He needed this paycheck to cover rent. They all needed their paychecks. The calculus of cowardice was swift and unanimous. Nobody stepped forward with a napkin. Nobody offered to help Sofia gather the broken pieces. They simply allowed the humiliation to hang in the air, a collective sacrifice to keep the predator appeased. Victoria stood victorious in the center of the enforced silence, adjusting the cuff of her tailored blazer. She was breathing slightly heavily, a smirk playing at the corner of her lips as she surveyed the terrified room. She drank in their fear, mistaking their silence for respect, their paralysis for loyalty. Sofia remained perfectly still. She didn't glance at the averted eyes of the executives or the trembling hands of the waitstaff. She was absorbing every detail, cataloging every face that looked away. The isolation didn't break her, it solidified her resolve. The Navarro Group was her life's work, built on the premise of elevating people. Yet here, in the very heart of her headquarters, the rot had set in so deep that an entire room would rather watch a woman be stripped of her dignity than risk their own comfort. The silence stretched to its absolute breaking point, heavy with the weight of 50 guilty consciences. Victoria's laughter was a sharp, jagged sound that echoed off the high ceilings. It was the sound of someone who believed they held every card in the deck. She took a step back, her eyes raking over Sofia's stained apron with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Am I sure?" Victoria repeated, her voice dripping with mockery. She looked around the silent room, inviting the witnesses to join in on the joke. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. You're a liability, you're clumsy, you're slow, and frankly, you're an eyesore in a room meant for excellence." Sofia didn't flinch. She stood amidst the shards of porcelain and the remnants of the lunch tray, her posture remarkably straight for a woman of her age. There was a gravity to her presence that Victoria was too blinded by ego to perceive. While Victoria saw a disposable service worker, the room began to feel a shift, a strange magnetic weight centering on the woman in the plastic gloves. "I will ask you one last time, Victoria Kane," Sofia said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a resonant clarity that seemed to bypass the ambient noise of the building. It wasn't the voice of a victim, it was the voice of a judge. "Do you truly wish to proceed with this? Is this the culture you believe this company stands for? Is this how you choose to lead?" Victoria's smirk faltered for only a fraction of a second, replaced with a flash of genuine irritation. The audacity of this woman to use her full name, to speak of leadership, was a bridge too far. "You don't get to talk about culture. You don't get to talk to me at all," Victoria hissed. "Security is on their way, and by the time they get here, I want you and your pathetic dignity out of this building. Consider your final warning received and ignored." Victoria turned her back, a dismissive flick of her wrist signaling the end of the encounter. She began to walk toward her usual corner table, her heels clicking a rhythmic, arrogant beat against the marble. She thought she was walking toward her lunch. She had no way of knowing she was walking toward the edge of a precipice. Sofia watched her go. There was no anger in Sofia's expression now, only a profound, weary disappointment. The test was over. Victoria had been given a bridge back to decency, and she had chosen to burn it. Sofia reached into the deep pocket of her apron, her fingers brushing against a small, encrypted device that didn't belong to a cafeteria worker. The grace period had expired. "Very well," Sofia whispered to the empty space where Victoria had just stood. "Proceed." The silence of the cafeteria didn't break. It transformed. It started as a low, synchronized hum, a collective vibration that seemed to rise from the very furniture. Then came the sound, a rhythmic, urgent staccato of pings and chimes echoing off the glass walls. In unison, 50 hands reached for pockets and handbags, 50 screens illuminated at once, casting a ghostly, rhythmic blue light against the pale faces of the executives. Victoria stopped mid-stride, her hand hovering over the back of her chair. Her own phone, nestled in a designer sleeve, was screaming, not the polite chirp of a text, but the jarring, soul-piercing siren reserved for a Priority 1 catastrophe. She pulled it out, her brow furrowed in annoyance. Red text pulsed against the screen, so bright it seemed to bleed. "Security breach, level 10, system lockdown initiated." The murmur that followed was unlike the previous whispers of gossip. It was the sound of true panic. Priority 1 was the ghost story told to new hires, the catastrophic failure of the global server, a total compromise of the Navarro Group's digital fortress. It was a protocol that hadn't been triggered since the company's founding. "What is this?" someone shouted from a far table. "The whole network is down. I'm locked out of my terminal." Victoria's thumb swiped frantically across her screen, her professional mask finally beginning to crack. "It's a glitch," she barked, though her voice lacked its usual bite. "Everyone stay calm. It's a server migration error. I'll have IT deal with it." But the phones didn't stop. The sirens intensified, shifting from a rhythmic pulse to a continuous high-pitched whine that set teeth on edge. At the edges of the room, the digital menu boards, usually displaying the price of organic kale and artisanal salmon, began to flicker. The images of food distorted into static, then smoothed out into a dark, commanding interface. In the center of the room, Sofia hadn't moved. She stood perfectly still amidst the shards of the broken plate, her arms hanging loosely at her sides. She was the only person in the room whose phone hadn't made a sound. While the world's most powerful executives scrambled like cornered animals, she looked like a captain watching the tide come in. Victoria turned, her eyes darted toward the security doors, expecting her team to burst through and restore order. Instead, the electronic locks engaged with a heavy, final thud. The glass doors didn't slide open, they sealed shut. The digital ripple had become a tidal wave, and for the first time, Victoria Kane looked at the invisible woman and felt a cold, sharp prickle of fear. The question Sofia had asked, "Are you sure?" was no longer hanging in the air. It was written in the red light reflecting off every surface in the room. The game hadn't just changed, it had ended. The static on the digital menu boards didn't just clear, it sharpened into a weapon. The Priority 1 warning vanished, replaced by a crystalline display of spreadsheets, scanned bank transfers, and encrypted chat logs. At the top of every screen, in a bold, clinical font, sat the title of a file Victoria thought existed only on a ghost drive in her private safe. Off-book ledger, Kane, V. Victoria's breath hitched. The blood drained from her face so quickly she felt the world tilt. On the screens where, moments ago, the special of the day had been advertised, the room now watched a slow, methodical scroll of her life's darkest work. $4.2 million redirected from the employee pension fund to a shell company in the Caymans. $1.8 million marked as operational expenses that were actually hush money for 3 junior associates who had tried to report her for workplace intimidation. A list of names, the very people she had called invisible, with notes beside them: terminated, redacted, blacklisted. The murmurs in the cafeteria shifted from panic to a terrifying, focused clarity. The executives weren't looking at their phones anymore. They were staring at the walls, then back at Victoria, their expressions hardening into a mix of shock and predatory calculation. They were sharks, and for the first time, they smelled blood on their own leader. "This is a deep fake!" Victoria screamed, her voice cracking, echoing pathetically against the sealed glass doors. "This is a cyber attack! Shut it down! Someone shut it down!" She lunged for the main control panel near the kitchen entrance, her expensive heels skidding on the spilled gravy and shattered porcelain. She didn't care about her dignity anymore. She cared about the paper trail that was currently ending her life in real time. She hammered at the screen, her fingers trembling, but the interface remained unresponsive. From the center of the room, Sofia finally moved. She didn't run and she didn't shout. She simply stepped out of the wreckage of the broken plate, her movements fluid and possessed of a strange, quiet grace. She didn't look at the screens. She didn't need to. She had seen every entry before they were broadcast. "The servers don't lie, Victoria," Sofia said, her voice cutting through Victoria's hysterics like a blade, "and they don't take bribes." Victoria turned, her hair disheveled, her eyes wide with a manic, cornered energy. "Who are you?" she hissed, the question finally catching up to the reality of the room. Sofia didn't answer with words. She simply looked up at the largest screen in the room. The ledger faded, replaced by a single, high-resolution image, a founding portrait of the Navarro Group. In the center of the photo stood a younger woman with the same piercing dark eyes and the same unshakable resolve. The silence that returned to the cafeteria was no longer a rule of survival. It was the silence of a tomb. Victoria scrambled toward the wall-mounted terminal beside the executive buffet, her movements jerky and stripped of their usual calculated grace. She shoved aside a bewildered intern, her fingers flying across the touchscreen with the frantic speed of a woman drowning. This was her system. She had helped design the security protocols. She knew the backdoors, the fail-safes, the scorched earth commands that could wipe a server in seconds. "Admin override," she hissed, her voice a jagged whisper. "Authorization code Kane Alpha 90." The terminal chirped, a cold, mechanical sound. A dialog box appeared, the blue light reflecting in Victoria's wide, bloodshot eyes. "Enter biometric verification." She pressed her thumb to the scanner so hard the glass threatened to crack. For a heartbeat, the spinning icon gave her hope. She just needed 10 seconds. 10 seconds to purge the ledger, to encrypt the bank records, to turn this nightmare back into a technical glitch she could spin to the board. The screen flashed a violent, pulsing crimson. Command rejected. "No!" Victoria gasped, hammering at the glass. "Override! Force delete all active displays! Source Executive Vice President!" The system didn't just reject her, it answered. The high-definition displays across the cafeteria flickered, and a new window snapped into place over the scrolling evidence of her crimes. The text was large, clean, and devastating. "Access denied. Global administrative privileges revoked. By Navarro S." The sound that escaped Victoria's throat was a strangled sob. She turned back toward the room, her back against the terminal as if she were facing a firing squad. The S didn't stand for a department or a server. It stood for Sofia. The woman in the stained apron hadn't moved an inch. She didn't need a terminal. She didn't need to scream. She simply watched Victoria's collapse with the detached observation of a gardener looking at a weed that had finally been pulled. "The system was built to protect the company, Victoria," Sofia said, her voice easily carrying through the hushed room. "Not the people who rob it. You spent 3 years trying to find the elusive founder to pitch her your vision of a leaner, more efficient workforce. You wanted to show me how you handled the small things." Sofia gestured toward the shattered plate and the scattered food on the marble floor. "You've shown me." Victoria looked down at her hands. They were shaking. For the first time in a decade, she realized she had no voice, no power, and no path back. The digital walls had closed in, and the woman she had treated like trash held the only key.
The digital evidence was a spark, but the human voice was the wildfire. The silence that had protected Victoria for years didn't just break, it evaporated. It started with a clatter, not of a falling tray, but of a mop handle being leaned purposefully against a marble pillar. Elias, a man who had buffed the floors Victoria walked on for 5 years without ever receiving a nod of acknowledgement, stepped forward. $2,000, Elias said. His voice was raspy but steady, cutting through the hum of the cooling fans. "That's what you tucked into my pocket last November, Miss Kane. You told me it was a Christmas bonus. All I had to do was make sure the 3 bags of shredded documents from the accounting department never reached the industrial recycler. I was supposed to burn them in the basement furnace." Victoria's head snapped toward him, her mouth opening to deliver a blistering retort, but before she could speak, a junior clerk from the back of the room stood up. Her hands were shaking, but her gaze was fixed on the digital screens. 50,000, the clerk whispered, then found her voice. "You offered me $50,000 to misplace the sexual harassment filings against the regional director. You told me I'd never have to worry about student loans again if I just clicked delete and looked the other way." The dam didn't just leak, it burst. One by one, the invisible people, the ones Victoria had treated as furniture, began to speak. A server from the kitchen line recounted the bribes offered to ignore health code violations to pad the quarterly margins. A security guard detailed the incentives he'd received to disable the cameras on the executive floor during off hours. The cafeteria, once a theater of Victoria's absolute dominance, had become a confessional. Each testimony was a rhythmic strike, a steady drumbeat of systemic rot. The executives at the tables, the sharks who had once feared her, now watched with a different kind of intensity. They weren't protecting her anymore. They were distancing themselves from the blast radius. Victoria spun in a circle, her eyes darting from face to face, searching for a single ally. She found only a wall of cold, hard truth. The people she had bought were now the ones selling her out, their voices rising in a chorus that drowned out the hum of the luxury building. Sofia stood at the center of the storm, her silver hair catching the light of the screens. She didn't have to say a word. The power she held wasn't in a title or a bank account. It was in the simple act of standing still while the world she had built finally demanded an accounting. "You think they're loyal to you?" Sofia asked, her voice a quiet anchor in the rising noise. "They were never loyal, Victoria. They were just waiting for someone to make it safe to be honest." Victoria stood in the center of the wreckage, her lungs burning as if she had been running for miles. The voices of the staff had finally trailed off, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the accusations. She looked at Sofia, her eyes bloodshot, her fingers still twitching toward the useless terminal. "It was a lapse in judgment," Victoria managed to choke out, her voice a thin, desperate rasp. "The pressure of the merger, the margins. Everyone makes mistakes in this industry, Sofia. You, of all people, should know what it takes to keep a ship this size afloat. I was doing what was necessary for the group." Sofia stepped forward, her heels, functional, sturdy shoes, clicking softly against the marble. She didn't stop until she was inches away from the shattered plate, the very spot where the confrontation had begun. "You think this is about the money, Victoria?" Sofia asked, her voice devoid of heat, which made it far more terrifying. "The embezzlement is a matter for the auditors and the police, but that's not why you're standing here alone today. You didn't lose your seat at the table because of a spreadsheet error." Sofia gestured broadly to the room, to the janitors with their mops, the clerks with their stained sleeves, and the kitchen staff who were no longer looking at the floor. "You lost it the moment you decided that some people are worth less than the tile they stand on. You built a career on the idea that power is the right to be cruel to the invisible. You thought that because they didn't have a title on their chest, they didn't have eyes to see your crimes or a voice to report them. You didn't just break a plate today, Victoria. You proved that you are fundamentally incapable of leading a company that bears my name." Victoria tried to straighten her blazer, a final pathetic attempt to reclaim her stature, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. "I'm the executive vice president," she whispered, as if the title were a holy relic that could protect her. "You can't just—" "I didn't fire you," Sofia interrupted, her gaze like iron. "You fired yourself. Every time you walked past a human being and chose to see a tool, every time you used your position to silence the vulnerable instead of protecting them. Arrogance isn't a leadership style, Victoria. It's a blind spot, and yours just cost you everything." Sofia looked away then, dismissive and final. The woman who had been fired 10 minutes ago was gone. In her place stood the architect of the empire, and the woman who thought she owned the world was suddenly very, very small. The heavy thud of the cafeteria's double doors, finally breaking their seal, sounded like a gavel hitting a block. Victoria spun around, a frantic spark of hope lighting her eyes as she saw Marcus Thorne, the head of human resources, striding toward the center of the room. Behind him followed two men in somber, charcoal gray suits, clutching leather briefcases like shields. "Marcus!" Victoria cried, her voice reaching a pitch of pure desperation. She took a stumbling step toward them, her hands outstretched. "Thank God! The system has been compromised! This woman, this worker, she's staged some kind of digital coup. You need to clear the room and get security to escort her out immediately." Marcus Thorne stopped 5 feet away. He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't even offer a look of sympathy. He looked at Victoria with the cold, detached professionalism of a man reading a death warrant. "We aren't here for the cafeteria staff, Victoria," Marcus said. One of the men behind him stepped forward, opening his briefcase to reveal a thick stack of documents. "Victoria Kane," he began, his voice flat and clinical. "I am representing the Navarro Group's board of directors. These are your formal termination papers, effective as of 4 minutes ago. Your access to all corporate accounts, physical properties, and digital assets has been permanently revoked." "You can't do this," Victoria hissed, her face pale. "I have a contract. I have—" "You have a morals clause," the lawyer interrupted, sliding a folder onto the nearest table, right next to a smear of spilled soup. "And more importantly, you have an active criminal investigation. These gentlemen are not from our HR department." He gestured toward the second man, who reached into his jacket. Instead of more paperwork, he produced a pair of heavy metallic restraints. The silver glinted under the cafeteria's recessed lighting. "Detective Miller, White Collar Crimes Division," the man said. "Victoria Kane, you are being detained for questioning regarding grand larceny, embezzlement of pension funds, and multiple counts of witness tampering." The sound of the handcuffs clicking into place was surprisingly quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. Victoria's knees buckled. The woman who had spent a decade commanding thousands was suddenly being led away like a common thief, her expensive heels dragging uselessly against the marble. She looked back once, her eyes wide with a hollow, haunting realization, but Sofia wasn't watching the arrest. The founder was already looking toward the kitchen staff, her expression softening as she prepared to begin the long work of repairing what had been broken. The legal reckoning was over. The healing was just beginning. The doors to the executive elevators hissed shut, swallowing the last echoes of Victoria's protests and the heavy tread of the detectives. A sudden heavy stillness settled over the room, a vacuum where an ego had once been. Sofia stood alone in the center of the marble expanse, the blue glow of the digital screens finally fading back to the soft, warm light of a midday lunch. With a slow, deliberate movement, Sofia reached for the knot at the back of her waist. She untied the heavy gray apron, the fabric stained with the evidence of Victoria's final act of cruelty. She folded it with a quiet, practiced precision, smoothing out the wrinkles before laying it across the back of an empty chair. She wasn't dressed in a power suit. Beneath the apron, she wore a simple white blouse and trousers that had seen years of honest wear. She didn't look like a billionaire, a founder, or a titan of industry. She looked like exactly what she was, the woman who had built this place stone by stone, person by person. "Elias," she said, her voice soft but carrying easily through the silent cafeteria. The man with the mop looked up, his shoulders finally losing the tension of 5 years of hiding. "I believe there's a mess on the floor that needs tending to, but today we're going to clean it up together." She didn't wait for him to respond. Sofia knelt. In front of the wealthiest and most influential executives in the city, the founder of the Navarro Group reached down and began to pick up the largest shards of the broken porcelain with her own hands. It was a small gesture, but it sent a shockwave through the room more powerful than the digital leak. One by one, the other invisible people began to move. The line cook stepped out from behind the swinging doors. The junior clerk came forward with a stack of napkins.
Even a few of the executives, moved by a sudden, jarring sense of shame, rose from their tables to help clear the wreckage. Sofia looked up, a faint, tired smile touching her eyes. She hadn't reclaimed her company with a speech from a podium or a memo from the top floor. She had reclaimed it from the ground up, proving that true authority wasn't something granted by a title or enforced through fear. It was the weight of one's character felt most strongly when one was standing at the very bottom. As she stood, her hands clean and the floor finally cleared, Sofia didn't look back at the executive wing. She looked toward the staff entrance. She had spent weeks as an observer, but as she walked toward the kitchen to thank the people who had kept the heart of the building beating, everyone in the room stood up. There was no order given, no protocol followed. They simply stood because they finally knew exactly who was leading them.
And that is how the invisible became undeniable. Victoria Kane learned the hard way that a title might give you a seat at the table, but it's how you treat the people around it that determines if you get to stay. If you enjoyed this corporate takedown and want to see more stories where the underdog finally bites back, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a chapter. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Sofia's hidden identity. Drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from. We have a global community here, and I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Thanks for watching, and remember, never underestimate the person holding the tray. I'll see you in the next one.